Taking your own advice is not always the easiest thing to do. What's going on, creative family? It's Dustin Falkema. Guys, welcome to another PSD breakdown where we deep dive into one of my Photoshop documents so that we can see the good, the bad, the ugly, some things that went right and other things that went wrong, and I just kind of hid the issue. So make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Click that bell icon so that you get notified as I upload new content, and I will see you guys in Photoshop. Alright guys, here we are in Photoshop with the final composite. This was my cropped version. I have my uncropped here, and then we can head all the way down to the bottom of the stack here. So I've got my raw image of Robin, raw image of Batman. If you guys want to know how I cut these out, I'll leave a card up here in the top right corner so that you guys can check out that tutorial. Now when moving up my composite, if I turn on this beauty here, this is where my background starts to come into play. My beauty pass here. This is really essentially the base of my 3D rendered background that I had thrown in here. Now I did throw a camera raw on that, so I can head here into the actual rendered file to show you guys some of the things that have to do with this 3D background. So first you'll see my beauty pass, which is essentially just how the render spit right out of Cinema 4D and Octane. And then moving up, we have the diffuse pass, which in this case is essentially a color pass with some lighting information in it. We have the reflection pass, which gives me the reflection, which I really only changed the reflection here to include just the top of the roof that they were on and not much else. Next, you'll see that I have a shadow pass here, which is essentially just giving me all of the shadow information based on the lighting that I have in the scene. And I use this quite often just to help push the shadows when needed. It's also really nice just to separate things that need to be separated without having to hand paint shadows into my composite. The Ambient Occlusion pass just gives really nice soft shadows to objects that are quite close together. Now, if you think about ambient lighting and figure maybe like an overcast day, this is really just going to give you shadows in between objects or certain pieces of the scene here. Like if you look in these windows up top, it's really giving some nice soft shadows in between the shutters here. And this is something that I often find useful for me when I'm doing composites, just to give me a little bit more separation from object to object if needed, without having any of the specific shadows from my shadow pass. Now above that, we have the Z depth. Now this is really nice if you guys are at all familiar with making the, say the cool 3D photos that are on Instagram or Facebook, any of that type of stuff. Essentially what this does is it just calculates the distance from the camera to the furthest part in your scene, and it just assigns those pixels, or the points in space, a certain value of gray. So it really goes from 0 to 1, so 0 being black and then 1 being 100% white. And then anything between that is primarily where you're going to see the differences in value from what would be our Z direction in 3D space. So immediately in front of you, looking straight back into space. Now this is used, I use this for a lot of things. We'll do some tutorials on this later on. I know that a lot of you guys are starting to finally look into 3D if you haven't been into it already. And I'd like to really break down some of the ways that I use some of these passes. I use the Z depth pass for depth of field generally, but I also really like to use it as a base for any type of atmosphere or fog, haze, anything like that. And so we'll break that down a bit later. Now moving into my ID passes here. So I have an object ID, which is essentially just giving every object that's in this scene a different color. Now this is primarily used just for masking situations. So if you want to make specific local adjustments, you can go through and you can just use your wand tool or the color range and start to select any of these objects individually. We have the material ID, which is essentially giving a different ID color to every individual material rather than object. So this is generally what I'll use most often. And sometimes I'll even go in and create my own masks, but this is a really good base that is quite easy to set up, and so I like to just kick this out, and I'll generally use this as needed. Now we have our shading normals, which these normals are really nice because they give you the RGB channels, which are essentially just your Y being your green channel, your blue being your Z channel, and your X being your red channel. And I like to use my normals a lot to pull and accentuate certain details, whether that's bits of lighting direction, just generally. And we'll also get into a few tricks that I've learned over the years of playing with these normals. Now, the reason why I use my shading normals is because I like to have my bump detail. Now, this really, we'll get into the whole, I'm not too happy with this render overall, but it's finished and not perfect. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But just know that there are various types of normals. You have geometry normals, tangent normals, shading normals, smooth normals, all kinds of different normal passes that you can choose from generally in your different render engines. But I typically like to just use my shading normal pass because it has all of my bump information from my materials in there. One cool thing that you can do is head into your RGB channels, and you can just start to pull all of these different values and create your own masks. We'll get to that in a later tutorial, but I think it's kind of good to just show you guys maybe why I would use these in a realistic scenario. So it's always good to really have a normals pass of any kind to use in your comps if you guys are rendering out in 3D packages. Now, the light direction pass is really similar to my normals pass, which this one here is going to be a little bit different than most that I may actually use. And that's because this scene overall is fairly ambiently lit, but if you have a lot of direct lights, you'll start to get specific information that's being pushed from each of these lights. And so you'll really see that go here. In this case, for this scene, I really didn't need to kick out a light direction pass. That's something that I didn't really use, but it was here, so I figured I'd mention it. All right, now with the passes discussion out of the way, we can talk about some of the things that I didn't really like too much, and they were truly finished and not perfect in this scenario. So it's something that I like to preach about a lot, and it's something that I'm currently practicing myself. And so just know that I'm taking my own advice, because this is something, when I get into 3D, I really enjoy that side of it. And so I can often spend way too much time. What I've been doing for quite a long time now is working on a finished and not perfect method if it doesn't need to be perfect, in which case most of the time those budgets are quite a bit higher, so the time is there. Now, in this one specifically, I knew that I didn't need to have a ton of detail running in my entire scene. And so for me, it was quite easy just to know that my focus was going to be from, say, this guide here and below, and so everything behind that was going to be filled with heavy atmosphere. Now, what I didn't think about was rendering a full res, or even like a region rendered preview at full res to see what this looked like. So if we go ahead and zoom in here, a lot of my details that are on the front of this rooftop aren't sharp, and the textures are quite large. And I mean, these cement textures here that are sitting on the antenna, the buildings have, the bump here was pushed way too heavily, and things are not scaled properly. Now, that's something that's to really be considered when you're using pre-made assets like I was here. And when I put all of this together, I was like, oh, cool. And in my small viewport render, this looked amazing. Everything looked good, to where I knew I wanted it to be to take into post. And I should have done something about that. Now, normally I would go ahead and just layer this, and we'll get to that here in a moment once we get to the other side here in the Photoshop document. But this was one of those things, especially this area here on this lower quadrant, that I really wish I had paid a little bit more attention to, and maybe push some of the reflections. If we look at our reflection pass here, you'll see that certain things really aren't pushed the way that they probably could have been. And so if I push that a little bit, or quite a bit here, but you can see that there's quite a few things that normally you'd want to have maybe a wet surface here on the top, knowing that I would want some rain in the overall scene for the atmosphere going on. And it was something I didn't focus on. So with that being said, just know that it doesn't always have to be perfect. And even when you screw something up and don't want to go back and render it, usually there's a way to make things happen. If there's a will, there's a way. And let's get back into our main comp here. All right, so back into the main comp, I have my beauty layer here, which I did throw a camera raw on. Now, I wish that I went through before doing this entire breakdown and I rasterized all my layers, and that was kind of a oh crap moment, because then I realized that I just merged down all of my adjustments. But I had thrown a camera raw, which helped a little bit kind of grunge up certain things. I did push the clarity quite a bit so that even though it was fuzzy and hazy detail, I mean, at least there's a little bit there and there's some breakup in the texture of my beauty render. Now, my shadow pass, I just use that, as I said before, just to kind of amplify some of the shadows and everything else that's going on in the scene. My ambient occlusion, now this is going in and this is really adding quite a bit of nice breakups to some of the scenes that are, or the seams, sorry, not scenes, that are going on here. And it just gives a little bit more depth to it there. Now, I went and threw a Z-axis pop here, which really helped bring a little bit more light to the front of the building. So if I press Alt and I click on this layer mask here, you can see how this was masked out. Now, I just did a simple lasso selection here to cut off the front face of the building because I didn't want that to be affected too much. But this is just giving a little bit more of a pop to the front faces of the buildings that are in the background there. Now, this general grade layer is just a gradient map that I use to give a blue hue to the scene overall. And then I went into an atmosphere depth, which was just using the depth pass that we previously discussed, and I use that on a solid color adjustment layer, and I can push and pull and tweak the values here in my depth map to give me a little bit more information here and there wherever it's needed. I'll do a tutorial on that specifically at some point. I'd really like to break down how I use some of these passes for you guys that are either just getting into 3D or maybe some more advanced stuff that I've learned over my time as a 3D artist. But this here will really help you create some quick atmosphere without having to do too much work. Now, the sky swap is just a sky swap, and this guy here, is just about building from the background here. What we're doing is just building up layer by layer, and so we don't have our Batman and Robin in this composite yet, but you'll see that there's a few things that will be hidden once we get them there. So moving along up the stack here, we have the building antenna paint, which is essentially just me grabbing a brush and painting onto these antenna that are up on top of the buildings. I wanted to have a little bit of detail there just to kind of create a little bit more of a silhouette. And so what I did here is I just grabbed the mask, or kind of an alpha, from my buildings here, and then just used that on a normal layer and brushed over that. Now, the midtone drop, this is essentially just dropping all of the midtones here with a curve, and then I just have a gradient that's not really letting that affect the sky too heavily here. And what I really wanted to do there is just make it a little bit more dark. I kind of like dark images, if you guys haven't noticed yet here on the channel. And so this kind of brings this all down into the value that I knew my overall composite would want to hit. Now, this depth drop layer here is essentially using my depth pass now to drop the values in the back buildings just so that they weren't too bright overall. And there's really not a whole lot more to that. It's just using another curves layer, kind of another mid-tone drop there. And then I have a light pop, which essentially just creates a light here on the front face that's going to somewhat mimic the light direction of Robin once we get him in there. Now, this reflection base is essentially, as previously discussed when we were going through the 3D renders, it's just giving a nice base reflection and making the top of this roof here look a little bit more wet. That's definitely one thing that I wish I would have pushed a little bit harder so that I could have some really sweet breakups, but we didn't have that, and so moving right along with it. So now we're getting into one of the fixes that I had made for this scene, and that was really taking a lot of these, like if you see here on especially the front panels that are on these buildings, they get really crunchy. And that's because my texture map was huge, and I had the normals, or sorry, not the normals. Well, it was the bump. So whatever, I forget what I used, or what was there from the bump channel, and it was just way too heavy. And so I just grabbed and kind of did a flat curves method here to make sure that I could drop the value of those and just kind of hide it overall. Now, this was just using my material ID to go in and select all of those similar panels that had the same material, and I just dropped those overall. Let's get back in here. All right, so the ground shadow layer, that's essentially just giving the ground and contact shadow for Robin. And then I thought that it would be a little bit cool to have the building lights on. And so what I did here is just use the material ID to go through and select all of my window elements. And then I went through and lasso selected the ones that I wanted off and on. Definitely something I could have done in 3D, but it didn't need to be perfect to get my point across. And so I decided not to spend the time there. Now the bat signal is essentially just an image here that I threw over it with a screen blend mode. And I figured that that's, it's kind of enough. You don't really need it to be, the focus of the image, but when you're doing a Batman composite, especially on a rooftop, having a bat signal looks kind of cool, I guess, right? Maybe, maybe not. So the smoke atmosphere, this was here just using a smoke brush to push a little bit more atmosphere from the ground up, I guess, perspective. And for this, I just used my material ID and my object ID to create a mask, and then just a normal layer to use a smoke / fog brush to paint in those details. So from there, we go into the rain particles. Now, in this case, I didn't get too detailed with it. I just had 2 rain overlays that I threw in here and scaled them down just a little bit so that they were smaller in the background than they would be the foreground. And I knew that I wanted to add a depth of field, so that wasn't going to be a heavily seen detail overall, but it was one of those things that I generally like to do that and just create some kind of depth with my effects overall. So the wet ground was just a photo overlay that I found of a cement pavement type water puddle reflection that I just blurred a little bit and masked it in there. There's nothing too very detailed with that. It was just a simple blend if method here to go in and pull some of that out of the shadows so that we could give kind of a nice look that it was almost natural for this rooftop. Now moving along here, I just dropped the sky here a little bit with the curves and then a slight gradient for the adjustment layer. Now all this did is just gave a little bit more emphasis to the bat signal without pulling too much detail out of the sky there. Now the background lighting pop here, I used this to somewhat simulate what could have been, say, like a lightning strike happening in the background, something that just had a little bit more illumination there on that side, which would also in turn help the silhouette of Batman once we get them in here. And then this gradient here is essentially just giving a little bit more of a pop that would happen right around Batman to really strengthen out his silhouette. So now that covers the basic background there. So we can go ahead and just close that group. We can pop on this merge background depth of field. Now what this did is essentially just gave a decent depth of field to the scene. This is another one of those things that it was finished and not perfect, because I didn't really get a perfect operation here, and you can see that some of the antennas that are on the top of these on top of the roof here is just a little bit funky. Now I could have gone through that and painted it out with a blur brush, but again, it wasn't something that is too noticeable once we throw the entire comp together. So at this point now we really get into the Batman and Robin part of the composite. And so this is really one of those areas that is quite fun to get into, because this is kind of obviously where you start to see everything get put together. So we had the Batman image there masked out. As I said, I have a tutorial on how I did this, and so that's already carded in the beginning of this video. So from there, I went through and I just did a curves layer, or a curves adjustment layer, and then went ahead and painted in some rim light and also a little bit of light accentuation on some of his equipment here. So I do have a tutorial already on how to paint rim lights, and I can leave that carded in the video as well here at this point, so that if you guys are wondering how that was done, we can go over that there in that video. Now, the local exposure drop is really focused around bringing some of the silhouette back to Robin once he actually got into the comp. So I knew that Robin would be in front of him, and so I wanted to pull some of the detail out of certain parts of Batman here, as well as strengthen up the silhouette here around his cowl. And I feel like what that did is it gave me a really nice kind of hard edge, you know, between the contrast and the separation that was happening there between him and the sky. The eyes are one of those things for me that I don't always like to sit and just paint white in the eyes this way. I know that, you know, it's a pretty cool look, but usually when I'm doing fairly realistic looking composites, or, you know, work of this sort, I don't really like to go with a straight just white comic eye. And so what I'll generally do is use the pen tool, and I'll go through here and select these eyes. I'll actually create a tutorial on this here on its own so that we can cover this. I have a whole series that I'd like to do on different eyes, and so we'll get to that at some point. But what I used here for this method was just a pen tool, and I went around both of the eyes here, created a selection from the mask, or from the path that was there, and just filled those with white right on its own layer. And then the eyeshadow is essentially just using a brush with a very low flow and, you know, low opacity, and just starting to build up some of the shadows and stuff that would be happening, you know, just given the light direction and whatnot in the scene. And then I do throw a curves layer on top of that, which just allows me to control, you know, the brightness and the intensity overall of the eye. And so for me at this point, it sat pretty well. And that was really it for the Batman specific adjustments. For Robin, it was quite a similar process actually. So I have Robin cut out, and then I went through and created just a gradient here that was essentially mimicking the shadow that would be coming off of the front of this building. Now, in hindsight, I would have probably went out and painted that a little bit better, because some of the values here, especially in the cape, really seem muddy. But that was something that I thought about quite a ways into the comp, and it was finished and not perfect, and I didn't really feel like I needed to go back and repaint that, especially once I got to the grading process. I was like, oh, we'll just leave it. It's not that big of a deal. And I'm nitpicking my work for no reason, because I knew that my client would be happy with these. So on top of that shadow adjustment, I have another clipped layer here that has a clipping mask all the way down to Robin, and that is just repeating my rim curves. And so it's essentially doing the same thing here, and just using a hard and soft brush and creating some nice rim effects on Robin there that emphasize his silhouette, you know, especially here with Batman behind him. I didn't want those values getting too dark to where they get muddied up once we got to grading. Now, these eyes are literally the exact same process that I did for Batman. I just used the good old pen tool, went around that, created the eyeshadow, and then used a curves layer to adjust that. And that's it for Batman and Robin with their specific adjustments. Now, I did do a few global adjustments, and so we can get right into these. I have my dodge. I did do a dodge and burn on Batman and Robin here, and so we can turn these on. So essentially for the dodge, I just went through and emphasized some of the areas of the subjects that I wanted to have a little bit more light on them. It's really just more of a macro dodge and burn, nothing too detailed, just to give a little bit more of an emphasis pop. And then the burn was exactly the same thing. Wanted to create, especially for Robin here, I wanted to go through and create some shadows on his face. And so I pushed those a little bit here with the burn curves. And then moving up into the orange light cast is something that I use to help accentuate the orange light here that was going on at the bottom of the scene that was hitting Robin. I knew that I needed to have a little bit on Batman because he would technically be in the same space. And so I went through and created just a curves layer, and I played with these values here a little bit in each of the channels to give me an orange hue that I could push onto his armor. The color match, this is essentially using the same color match that I'll put a card here for the process that I use for that. But even when I'm using a 3D rendered background and I start to do any type of post on it, and then I'm putting subjects into that, I still go ahead and I do the color matching process on them so that everything still stays cohesive. So whether it's a photo backplate or a 3D rendered backplate, it's still always good to kind of perform this type of process. And so I'll have this tutorial already on my channel, and so I'll show you guys how I did that there and leave a card here. The Specular Pops is something that I'll also put a tutorial together on, but this was essentially to give my subjects a little bit more of a wet feel to their face, kind of moisten their skin just a little bit, especially here on Robin, who would technically be getting maybe almost directly hit from the light that's down here on the bottom right. And essentially what that is a curves layer that is pushing these midtones quite a bit. And then I go ahead and use my blend if options to remove it from the shadows, or pull it out of the shadows and then into the midtones, so that it's primarily only hitting some of the more highlighted parts of the face and the armor. And so I felt that was a really good way to kind of help some of the metal stand out here on his chest, as well as kind of give him a sweaty look. And I know that Batman here has a little bit on his face there. So that wraps up Batman and Robin. I feel like this is getting quite to a long video at this point, but hopefully this is helping somebody maybe see some of the things that are going into this and kind of the thought process behind them. It's definitely not always perfect, and so that's really, in an image like this, the final composite, a lot of people may ooh and ah over it, but as an artist, it's always easy to go back and just want to nitpick everything down to a dime and make changes and go back and tweak and make changes and go back and beat yourself up over it. And it doesn't always need to be that way. Sometimes you can just create cool artwork and people will love them for what it is. Now, on top of Batman and Robin, this is where we get into some more of the effects side of things here. I went and added 2 fog light overlays, just to kind of give a little bit more the look and aesthetic of there being atmosphere in the scene. And it really kind of helps push a little bit of the eyes here. And it makes sense even of, especially say this rim light that I had on Batman here, it gives a little bit more sense and reason to why that would be there. Now we're getting into the Foreground Rain. The Foreground Rain is really just another overlay. So there's a ton of different overlays here. I forget where I got these. I think this one was part of a pack that was from photobash.org. Now this layer here, so these are the drops on Batman and Robin layers. So what I did is I grabbed an image of water on glass. Now this is kind of the cheap and lazy man's way of doing it. But what I did here is I just grabbed a bunch of different images and laid them over my models here and went through the warp transform and just kind of pushed and pulled different parts of it to give somewhat of the illusion of being warped around their armor and their breastplates, things like that. So it's really not something that's super noticeable. It's kind of one of those details that, you know, for people like myself who like to zoom into artwork and look at it at full scale, or if the client was printing this on a much larger canvas, it would be, you know, something that's pretty cool for them to see. But it's not perfect, but it definitely gives the illusion of maybe water being there and sitting. I could have spent a little bit more time maybe dodging and burning and really making the armor or the fabric on their cosplays look wet, but I didn't think it was too needed at this point. So last but not least, we're getting into some of the more, I guess, hand painted aspects of this composite here, or like the rain effects. And that was really just putting a few more details of maybe drips and water running off of my subjects. Now, this was really one of those fake it till you make it, you know, type of scenarios, because I didn't really feel like going in and spending a long time painting details. And so it really was scribbles. I went through and I just with a white brush and, you know, about half, you know, opacity with my pen pressure sensitivity, and I just started, you know, kind of scribbling where I thought some of this water might be running off on the models. And it gives a certain level of detail just to kind of put them into the scene, even though it's not perfect. I mean, this here, I don't know what that was. I just kind of scribbled a little fake splash water drop. And then I have the splash paint here, which is essentially just a brush that I created, which again, I think this was from the rain pack from Photo Bash. And I went through and I just created some of the details here that are definitely not perfect, but it shows enough of kind of the hint of detail from things that would be happening, or, you know, maybe getting hit by pools of water on the top of my subjects, shoulders, you know, top of the hands, and then especially right here on the foreground ledge. And I left those there a little bit bigger than maybe they normally would be. And that's primarily because it was more to give a hint of detail and let your brain know that, hey, this is something that really happens when it rains. Water pools up and it, you know, kind of splashes, and, you know, it's definitely not a perfect scenario. I can show you guys actually real quick here what this brush looks like, and then in another tutorial we'll get into how to create these type of brushes and use them in your artwork. All right, so here we are in a new document. I just want to show you guys this rain brush because it's not anything special, but it definitely works to add a little bit more detail. So like I said, I think that this is the base image that I used to create the brush was just another one of the rain brushes from Photo Bash, or sorry, the rain overlays that I just put into Photoshop and created a brush from. And this brush overall, I just went through and created a custom brush that will give me a little bit of jitter and rotation, and it will flip the brush around. So when I'm going through and I'm putting this on certain aspects of the subject, I can then just paint around and give the hint of details and things that are needed in certain areas. So we'll get into this here and how to build, you know, your own custom effects brushes and stuff in different tutorials, but just know that it's nothing overly detailed, and at the end of the day it just gives a hint of, you know, the details and things that would be happening in the scene physically that can really make it pop and stand out. So that's really it now for this PSD breakdown. That's exactly how the comp looked before I went into Lightroom. And as I've stated in previous videos, I like to use Lightroom for my grading and final adjustments on most of my artwork. And that's primarily because I don't have all of the tools that I have in Photoshop. And I often find myself spending unneeded time in Photoshop doing things that I could just do with the, you know, basic fundamental tools of Lightroom. and not get too nitpicky in Photoshop. And so it's really one of those places that I really forced myself to stop focusing so much on every heavy detail really every fine detail. And then I went into Lightroom and started making a lot of adjustments there instead of Photoshop. So it saves you a lot of time, or saves me a lot of time, because I like to do my own grades, especially for client work. I don't use presets. I don't use anything like that when I'm doing this type of work here. And I create everything kind of custom per image. And if I do that type of thing inside of Photoshop, it can take quite a bit longer because I like to focus a lot on details. And so it just takes those options away from me and allows me to go in Lightroom and just do a few simple pops, throw a smooth grade on, work with some luminosity masking to make certain aspects of the comp stand out, but not get too heavily nitpicky with all of the fine print. Then I went in and cropped it. So this is the final image here and what I delivered to the client, and they were extremely happy. So huge shout out to Debonair Dyad Cosplay. Links down in the description. Go check those guys out. Awesome guys. They work with few charity groups and the League of Enchantment here in Michigan. Just an awesome group of people as a whole. So make sure to follow these guys. Go show them some love. But yeah, that concludes this PSD breakdown, guys. All right, guys, so that wraps up this PSD breakdown. Thank you so much for checking it out. Now, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm thinking about doing my first Q&A at 2K subs here, which will be coming out fairly soon. So make sure to watch out for some community posts, and also on my other social platforms if you guys follow me there. If not, make sure to do so. It'd probably be a pretty cool thing. You know, we all get to know each other and hang out, network, all that cool stuff. So it feels good to be back. It just it's been a while since I put out a video, so it kind of, you know, it's like getting all this stuff back out there a little bit. Now I'm looking at doing a couple tutorials here coming up after this video, so make sure to stay tuned for those as well. And always remember to create more, say less, and stay creative, guys. I'll see you in the next video.